Professor Gordon, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for making the time to give this interview. I should start by saying congratulations on publishing your new book.
Thanks so much, and I'm very happy to talk to you about academic freedom today.
Wonderful, that is perfect. So, in the context of teaching and learning in the university space, what is your understanding of the concept of academic freedom, and what factors do you think constitute academic freedom?
Academic freedom is basically the right of professors to do research and to teach the way they wish to do it without other people telling them exactly how to do it. It's been a subject of struggle for over a century. If we think about the United States in the early 20th century, there were states that had laws banning the teaching of evolution, not only in high school but in college and mid-century. Many laws banning communists from the universities. Academic freedom attempts to carve out a space for people not to be discriminated against based on their political affiliations, and also a space to pursue the disciplines in any direction they take experts.
So from what you say, it clearly shows that there is a very close relationship between what we can say the freedom of speech and academic freedom. What do you think is that relationship based on?
That's one of the hardest questions, actually, in the whole field of academic freedom studies. Every freedom involves some limits. No freedom is absolute. This is true both academic freedom and freedom of speech. If we were to imagine, say, an engineering professor taking time out from class to tell students to vote for Donald Trump, our intuitive reaction is that doesn't sound like an exercise of academic freedom. But if you look at it through the lens of free speech, it is an exercise of free speech. Because in our country, political speech is specially protected. So we can begin to see a parting of the ways between academic freedom and freedom of speech in certain situations. Academic freedom tends to put a stronger accent on professional ethics. And free speech is a more libertarian concept that allows you to say almost anything you want. The lines are blurry, though, so many of the hot debates today have to do with this very question. For example, professors tweeting things that are racist. The racist speech may be covered under the Constitution by freedom of speech, but I think you could strongly argue that it creates a bad image of the professor of the university. It can contribute to a bad learning environment for students. So in some cases, a university may intervene to curtail a professor's speech.
It's interesting that you bring the idea of tweeting or ways of sharing ideas that professors do outside probably writing academic journals or writing an op-ed in a newspaper or teaching something in the classroom. Does the university get to control what a professor probably shares as personal opinion on Twitter?
So, part of the background to this idea of academic freedom is there's no standard and enforceable definition of it. In other words, there's no organization that is actually authoritative and in charge of upholding specific ideas of academic freedom. This is different from the legal profession, where the bar associations can disbar lawyers who violate their professional ethics. The same thing is true in medicine. So there's one organization called the American Association of University Professors. It was founded in 1915. It issues documents defining academic freedom and applying it to different controversies. But first of all, it has no ability to enforce. It's purely advisory. Secondly, if we look at its history, which I do in the book, it changes its concepts of academic freedom very frequently. So this is really something that needs to be discussed and worked out at a university by university basis. And what I've tried to do in the book is provide the history of different concepts of academic freedom, so you can sort of go into the debate knowing which one you stand for. So in terms of your question, in the early 20th century, professors were often fired for reasons that today, don't look legitimate, like publishing a letter to the editor, criticizing the governor of the state. Then before you know it, the governor is putting pressure on the university president to fire this person. And that actually happened a lot. And it's one of the reasons for the creation of the American Association of University Professors. But that doesn't mean that all examples of what we call extramural speech outside the walls of the university, are permissible. I was trying to get at this with the example of racism. I mean, a hospital can't really allow a doctor to make comments online saying that certain types of people deserve better treatment than others.
Oh, yes, yes.
In fact, doctors have been fired for that sort of thing. Well, what about a professor who does the same thing? And in a country like ours, which is so large and has thousands of universities and professors, these limits are being constantly tested all the time. There are conservative academics who feel that the so-called political correctness factor has become too strong, and if they publish conservative ideas, that there's an unfair backlash against that. The larger history reveals that it's usually professors on the left, who've been disciplined for their extramural speech, but there are cases on both sides. So I'm afraid it remains unresolved and is really very context specific. One factor is whether the professor giving a speech or publishing an op-ed is speaking within the professor's area of expertise. If it's a political science professor talking about a foreign policy issue and making a provocative argument, that, however, is based on research and many years of thought, that's one thing. What about the professor who sort of mouths off, so to speak, completely outside the academic field? Is that covered by academic freedom? It will tend to be covered less so.
Given that, we are talking of people that are engaged in imparting knowledge on students in the university, who should be allowed to teach in the university? And what is it that constitutes unacceptable political indoctrination in the classroom?
Yeah, great question. Well, originally American colleges and universities were religious. Professors were chosen for their character and their piety. The great change in the history of higher education in the United States, it starts around 1890. Even though Harvard, Yale, Princeton are older institutions, it's actually the creation of Johns Hopkins University that is the turning point, because it's founded as a research university on the German model, which means that professors will be hired based on expertise within a discipline. So that remains, the basic answer to your question: who should be hired to teach? Those who are experts in the disciplines which the university offers. And academic freedom will protect them as long as they're working inside of their disciplines. The biologist gets to set his or her own research agenda and decide which textbook to choose when teaching. Since the 1960s, there's been a competing idea of the university, which is that it's not all about pure academics, that the university is an important site for democracy. It's in the 60s that students gained the right to form political clubs, which they hadn't before, to hold demonstrations on campus, which had been banned before. New disciplines are formed, such as women's studies and black studies in the late 60s and early 70s, disciplines which are committed to progressive change. So we are now, in the 21st century, reckoning with these competing and sometimes conflicting models of what a university is and how it relates to democracy.
Interesting that you talk about the establishment or the creation of Black Studies departments and Women's Studies departments. What are the implications of the creation of these type of studies or departments to academic or for academic freedom?
Yeah, I can answer this in personal terms. When I started writing my book, What is Academic Freedom?, I leaned very heavily to the view that professors should keep politics out of the classroom. And if you're dealing with a controversial issue, whether it's moral, religious, or political, the best you can do is just expose students to competing views and let them decide on their own. But when I studied the formation of women's studies and black studies in particular, I encountered some very penetrating criticisms of the idea of academic objectivity. And the idea that knowledge or the pursuit of knowledge can be completely separated from our values and from our political assumptions. So the founders of Black Studies departments were extremely articulate about the idea of academic freedom as it relates to the ideal of academic objectivity, and their goal was to loosen up the ground. Their argument was that if we looked at what the disciplines had really been doing through most of the 20th century, they were promoting one political value or another. So I was affected by that. I in my own teaching, I continue to do as much as possible as to leave my own opinions out of it. But I've reached the point where I understand why other people teach differently. And the only question is, can one sometimes go too far? I mean, if you're repeatedly announcing the same political goals and not allowing students to question them and only giving them essay questions where they can affirm your own ideas as a professor, that's arguably indoctrination.
Yeah, it becomes problematic.
Yeah. But I think, if we look at politically committed teachers, the best of them don't operate in such a vulgar fashion. They're trying to expand students' consciousness by exposing them to certain ideas they may not have been familiar with and expressing sympathy for some ideas more than others. But I'd like to think, that the best politically activist professors will allow the classroom to become a forum of debate, which is really what I think it should be.
Definitely. Do academic boycotts, such as those directed against Israel, violate the spirit of academic freedom?
Basically, they do. But this is another example of how I changed my mind in the writing of the book. And I've mentioned this twice now because it's important to me. And in the introduction of the book, I say, ideally when we write a book, we shouldn't know exactly what we're going to say. It's a learning process that we want to share with the reader. So I'm what many people would call a supporter of Israel. And as I became familiar with the boycott movement, I tended to feel strong disapproval, like not hiring Israelis, not allowing Israelis to serve on the editorial board of a journal, not allowing them to be a guest lecturer at a university, and so on. This strikes me as counter to the spirit of academe. I think we really want to judge people by what ideas they bring to the table, not their nationality. It's almost like excluding people because they're members of the Communist Party.
Oh, yes.
But in the chapter I wrote about the boycotts, I stressed that very often today supporters of Israel reacting to the boycotting of Israel do exactly the same thing. They boycott the boycotters. They won't allow supporters of the boycott movement against Israel, in some cases, to speak at their university. There have been court cases where pro-Israel organizations have tried to prohibit the club Students for Justice in Palestine from existing at specific campuses. And finally, which is not very well known, there are a lot of state laws in the United States, 35 states to be more precise, which actually say that supporters of the boycott of Israel cannot receive any public funds. Cannot be a guest lecturer, for example. And so what I see is what I call a kind of boycott syndrome, where each side thinks it has the right to cancel out the other and to keep it off the campus because they're so convinced that what the other side is doing is worse than what they're doing. And it's a downward spiral from there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Gordon, for the time. Have a good day.
Thank you, Stu.
Wonderful.